we have the hand mic? Okay, I just want to make sure it was ready. I can't remember when, it must have been like roughly 3 weeks ago. Walter and I were talking after class, and he had brought up a incident that he recalled back when he was attending, I can't remember if it was a Methodist or Baptist church. You remember the story, Walter? Yeah, with your mom, when you went to your mom. And can you make it the short version, the abridged version?
Sure.
I thought it was interesting. I thought it would be nice to share it with the class.
So I grew up in a combination Methodist Baptist family, but I attended the Southern Baptist Church, and I remember we had this discussion in Sunday school one day, and we were talking about, Christ, and Baptist churches are Trinitarians, and they were talking about the Jews, and they said, man, it's those Jews, I don't know about them, they killed, I'm going to quote it to you, as they said, they killed God, we just can't accept that kind of thing. And I said, oh my goodness, yeah. And I came home, and I was telling my mom about the lesson. She almost tanned me when I said, but she said, you to get this straight now, Walter. The Jews are God's people. They are important. You cannot talk that way about them. Besides, Jesus is not God. No. She knew all this because my grandfather, I didn't know him well, was a die-hard, brimstone, higher and heck preacher. And so he set her straight with all kinds of stuff. And so that changed my ways after that for a while. So I thought I'd pass it on.
All right. So I thought that was fitting because I'm going to show you a video. It's outside my PowerPoint presentation. My PowerPoint presentation is getting pretty big. So I'm going to play this directly from a media player. Hopefully that's not going to cause any technical difficulties. But I think it dovetails well with what you see in the video here as far as the attitude toward the Jews within mainstream Christianity. Has anyone here read the book Constantine's Sword? Has anyone ever heard of Constantine's Sword? Okay. There's actually there's a book, very big, thick book, about 1.5 inches. Definitely recommend it to anyone who's interested in this particular topic. And the author came out with a video. It didn't really follow the book very closely, but it still was nonetheless an interesting video. Why I bring that up, besides the fact I recommend Constantine's Sword to read, I'm going to be showing over the period of this class, or the extent of this class, however long it goes, snippets from the video from the movie Constantine's Sword. So what you're going to see here is probably like a 2-minute snippet from Constantine's Sword, the video. All right, so Walter, hopefully. No, we don't have audio. It's 100%. So the author, this actually was the book was a bestseller, and the author, he was a Catholic priest, and Vietnam caused him to rethink a lot of
When I was a kid, the death of Jesus was what first grabbed me. It was a figure like...
So the one here speaking, you see, he's the author, and he figures prominently in the video. But he was a Catholic priest. He left the priesthood probably in his 20s during the Vietnam War because he had doubts as far as the Catholic Church's position with respect to war. Now he is looking at the Church's involvement within, as far as the topic of anti-Semitism. So that's who you see here. So I'm going to back it up here so you don't miss any. All right, take 2.
When I was a kid, the death of Jesus was what first grabbed me. It was a figure like this that I would kneel before next to my mother.
The power of the Passion story, even for someone like myself who cannot accept the divinity of Jesus, the story of his mortality is supremely moving.
But this is a man I love.
Yeah.
And also a man to whom I pray.
My problem has been that when I stand before a figure like this, I can appreciate them and be moved by them only on condition that I shut down a piece of my heart and that I obliterate something of what I know about the actual consequences in the real world of these images and of these figures.
For you?
Well, no, not for me. I'm an American Jew born in the 1950s. That makes me one of the spoiled brats of Jewish history. I'm one of the luckiest Jews who ever lived. But certainly for my parents and for the people who preceded them, yeah. The supremacy of the cross in European culture was responsible for the death of many of my people centuries before I was born, and eventually for the death of my own family in southeastern Poland. I'm the descendant of the victims, so you have a much more difficult problem than I do. In other words, if you want to understand anti-Semitism, don't study Jews, study non-Jews.
Why do we blame the Jews? Generation after generation, where does this contempt come from? And every Good Friday service with the reading of that Passion narrative, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, it really hits the ear. And Jesus is against the Jews. And I don't know how else Christians can hear this story.
I'll bring back up my PowerPoint. So last week, we were talking about the distinction that needs to be made between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. Does anyone remember what the distinction is between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism? All right, so which one's against a race? Well, in this case, we're talking about the Jewish race. So which of the terms, anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism, is a bigotry or hatred based upon race?
Anti-Semitism.
Right. So that leaves anti-Judaism, which is what? How do we define it?
Against the doctrines and beliefs and religious practices of the Jews.
Right. And another way you could say it is a way of life, the Jewish way of life. And that involves, of course, their religion. So when we were looking at the book of John, the reason I got into bringing up the term anti-Judaism is because of what we find happening in certain places in the New Testament. First Thessalonians was one. John specifically has been singled out as being an anti-Semitic book, which is why I had to bring up the term anti-Judaism. Because if you were a Jew, as we understand John to be, you cannot be anti-Semitic. It's like me having a business and being anti-capitalist. You cannot reconcile the two. So we needed a new term, and that was anti-Judaism. And that would allow us to separate any opposition or, hatred is a little bit too strong, but opposition, antagonism to a way of life without it being based upon a hatred of a person's race. So that was the need for introducing anti-Judaism. And we went through John, we went through all these passages, find the clicker. Here it is. I'm not going to go through and read these all over again. The reason I got into John was that if you were to do this exercise and look up the term the Jews in the New Testament Gospels, you will find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the term the Jews has no antagonistic, derogatory sense whatsoever. Nowhere in Matthew, Mark, or Luke will you find derogatory context for the term the Jews. But as soon as you get into the book of John, that changes. Half the instances of the phrase the Jews in John are always in a antagonistic, derogatory, in an oppositional context. So that's why I had to bring up the term anti-Judaism to explain what we're seeing in John. Now, I asked last week, why do we see it in John and not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And Jacob took a stab at this. I'm going to make it even more difficult if you can remember your answer, Jacob. How would you explain it then when we get to the book of Acts? Will this, the answer, if you remember, apply and explain what we find in Acts? Because here we have on the screen just the beginning of a large list of passages where we find the term the Jews, just like we did in John, in a very negative context. So here we have first one in Acts 9, and after that many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel to kill him, Saul. And then next passage, and because he saw it, it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. This is referring to arresting many of the disciples and with the intent of putting them to death. On Acts 13:45, but when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with envy, and they spake against those things which were spoken by Paul, contradicting and blaspheming. It goes on, Acts 13, but the Jews stirred up the devout and honorable women and the chief men of the city and raised persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them out of their coasts. Acts 17, but the Jews, which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort and gathered a company and set all the city on an uproar and assaulted the house of Jason and sought to bring them out to the people. And it continues, Acts 20, and there abode 3 months, and when the Jews laid wait for him as he was about to sail to Syria, he purposed, Paul that is, to return through Macedonia. Acts 20:19, serving the Lord with all humility of mind and with many tears and temptations which befell me by the lying in wait of the Jews. Acts 21:11, and when he was come to us, he took Paul's girdle and bound his own hands and feet and said, I think this was Agabus, thus saith the Holy Ghost, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man who owneth this girdle and shall deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. And it continues, Acts 21:27, and when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews, which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him. Acts 22:30, on the morrow, because he would have known the certainty wherefore he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear and brought Paul down and set him before them. And it continues. Acts 23:12, and when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Acts 23:27, this man was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And it continues. You get my point. It goes on and on. Why do we, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, see no such usage of the term the Jews in the derogatory oppositional context that we see here in Acts and in John? So, you want to give a stab?
I think I'm probably wrong with John, but they're, well, I guess the culpability is there in Acts, right? because the deed has been committed. But it's also noteworthy to say, like, if you say the Americans are attacking Israel, it's not you and I, right? It's the country of America, right? So it's the leadership, it's the people in charge.
So the Americans is like shorthand, because you don't want to actually take the time to say U.S. military, the Biden administration,
Correct.
the Democratic, whatever, how you just want to say the Americans.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a generalization. I mean, I think in Acts, there's more culpability because they had been the ones who, but it's also noteworthy to mention the stories of at Jesus's crucifixion and at the death of Stephen. It makes a point that they both say, forgive them, don't hold this to their account. Like, basically both say, forgive them for what they're doing.
But you can only be forgiven at the point you state that. If you have sin after that, you still have to deal with that.
Correct. But I think it's also, because I think in those specific instances, it's to admonish us not to be Jew blamers, to discourage that. But anyway, that was not a correct answer, I know. It was more
It's
of a
not.
side note.
I didn't hear a buzzer go off, but
Yeah.
Jacob?
Going off kind of what Rob is laying forth is there's a lot of generalizations that occurs in the book of Luke, or in the book of Acts, right? So he doesn't say specifically the different types of Gentiles. He just says there's the Jews and then there are the Gentiles. So I think in Acts, he's at least is making that differentiation from those who were of the religious order, because we know that the Jews, there were a lot of different sections within the Jews. You had the Zealots, you had both the Pharisees, Sadducees, so there were a lot, but there was just a generalization, I believe, that was occurring with what Luke was writing when he was proposing this to, what King Agrippa, or what king was it that he was actually writing all this for, so that he had this form of insight?
So generalization is your, okay. So we got Joe, and I think Jerry wants to say something.
So part of it is what Paul predicts in Romans chapter 11. He's very clear of why this is all going on. He says, now I am speaking to you Gentiles in view of the fact that I'm apostle to the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry. If I can somehow make my people jealous and save some of them, for if their rejection brings reconciliation to the world, that will their acceptance being but life from the dead. So he states right here, here's the purpose of the jealousy, here's the purpose of the conflict, and he sums it up. It says, now if the first fruits offered up are holy, so is the whole batch, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. So I think that is a tremendous worldview of Christ, of the Gentiles, of the Jews, and he says it's to provoke them to jealousy, to come back. And that's what you're seeing in all these passages in Acts, is jealousy, envy, and slander against Paul and against Silas and against Barnabas. In every single case, they're stirring up the Gentiles to make a false accusation against Paul to stop the spreading of this. Why? Because it indicts the Jew for what happened to Christ. And so they want to stop this as quickly as possible and keep it within the boundaries of Israel. And now Paul's engaging all these Gentiles around the Mediterranean and basically saying the Jews have rejected the message, so we're taking it to the Gentiles, and the Jews' surge in all of this is to stop it immediately, to make it go away, because otherwise they won't have any habitation around the Mediterranean besides their own country.
Okay. So the specific question I was asking is, why in Matthew, Mark, and Luke do we not find the term the Jews put into this negative, antagonistic, context, but we do in John and Acts? Jerry?
So I think what's going on here is John has a connection to the Sanhedrin, either through his father or in some fashion, and he was very aware what the leadership, in this case the Sanhedrin, were thinking about Jesus and things like that. We get a sense of that because when Jesus was taken from Gethsemane, John was allowed into the trial room. There was no objection to that, having one of his own disciples there.
Jacob and I had a long discussion about that. I actually have a different take on that. Let's just say all that's true. How does it explain Acts?
Well, I mean, the thing is that he was privy to what was going on. In fact, you recall that when Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem, that the response was, the Jews of late have wanted to kill you. You can't go there. So there was like kind of this inside knowledge, probably from John, that this is what they're planning for you. Like, I have information that the Sanhedrin, let's just say for sake of argument, are coming after you to kill you. Now, Jesus knew this anyway. This wasn't like a new thing. But I think in that case, in that sense, John has we'll call it insider information. He knows what's going on as a person. I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have that kind of knowledge to know that.
But Luke is the one who actually wrote the book of Acts. So why is he not antagonistic toward the Jews in his gospel, but then when he writes Acts, we find it over and over and over again? I can get into a little bit more, because there's a little bit of disagreement as far as John having access to the Sanhedrin. There's an interesting alternative to that, but I'm not trying to dismiss that position. I'm just saying, how does that explain Acts as far as the antagonism we're seeing, but we don't see it in the Gospel of Luke? That is a bit of a puzzle. Walter, you gonna take a stab?
So the first thing that's interesting to keep in mind is, I looked it up some time ago, the phrase you keep referring to as the Jews, it is the exact same Greek word everywhere. So that helps to know that nothing changed in terms of who the audience is in that sense.
Yeah, that's exactly what, so everything I've shown here, when I'm saying you don't find it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's the same word. It's like oi, judoi, something like that. But it is the same word that when we're talking about here. But continue, I'm sorry.
All right. And so in those earlier Gospels, we don't see Christ and his followers as much of a threat to the stability of the kingdom, if you will. There is trouble, but some of the leaders, like Gamaliel says, just wait it out. This guy will be gone. We ain't got nothing to worry about. But when we come to Acts, we have Paul, a Pharisee of the Pharisees, a learned person who knows the law and everything, and he's standing up and telling the average person, no, this Christ is the one. He is the Messiah you've been waiting for. And now the apple cart is not only getting turned over, it's getting rolled down the hill. And if they don't do something about it, and that Jews, I think, is the leadership, there's going to be some real serious problems going on. And that's why the hostility is now really beginning to get ramped up.
Okay. So I appreciate everyone's. David, you want to throw in your 2 cents?
The Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they call those the synoptic Gospels because they're very similar. John is a completely separate emphasis, and John tells us why he wrote his book. He says, "But these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name." And so John's purpose was to emphasize that Jesus was the Messiah. And that's what Acts was all about, was they were spreading the gospel that Jesus was the Messiah. So I don't know exactly what you're looking for, but that's one reason.
Well, I could argue that it's hard to believe that Matthew, Mark, and Luke weren't trying to get across that Jesus was the Messiah. I understand, that if you had to look at what was John attempting to do, and he spells it out in Acts 20, I would agree with you, but I would have a hard time believing that Matthew, Mark, and Luke weren't trying to do the same thing, even though they didn't specifically state that was what their intent was. Let me throw out my 2 cents. I did last week. Well, could this have to do with timing? The hatred toward the Christians, antagonism, increased over time. Is that true or false? Okay, it increased. Could it be that John and Acts were written at a later date than Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And what has happened is that you are getting more and more antagonism against the Christians by the Jewish leaders. Again, we throw in a little bit of generalization, which I think is going on too. But as time progressed, you get to the point in the book of Revelation, Jesus is calling Jews essentially the synagogue of Satan. We're seeing more and more antagonism by the Jewish leaders, pushback across the Jewish, well, I won't say there isn't a kingdom, but you had synagogues and the word spread and realized what a threat Christianity was posing to, the traditions of the elders and what was perceived to be the truth of Moses. So therefore, there is more emphasis on a we versus them as time progressed. Could that be an explanation I'll throw out there? So I didn't want to get bogged down with that question. It's really a good something to think about as you come across all these passages in John and Acts. Why is that happening? And I still had a couple more screens here. I'm not going to go. So as a review, anti-Semitism is hostility, prejudice, or discrimination against Jews. Anti-Semitism is widely considered to be a form of racism. So this is why, and I think, Robert, you weren't here. I think you missed this. This was what I'm trying to bring forward as an explanation of what we're encountering in John and Acts. It's not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Judaism. I'm not going to read this article. I don't want to rehash a lot of last week. We got into what is Judaism, and I think Rob did a really good job explaining that. Essentially, it's the Jewish way of life, which includes their religion. So the video I started with, what was the focus? It was, why is it Christians why are they blaming the Jews? And it ended with that call and response there in the Catholic Church on whatever, Good Friday or Easter, where it's read, it says, and the Jews said, crucify him, crucify him. When you use the term, if you're using the generalization, the Jews, and you do it over and over and over and over again, what impact does that have upon the psyche of those who are listening or hearing the story? Because we have the advantage of reading the Bible. We have the Bible in front of us. We can read it. We can make the distinction that, okay, this is referring to the scribes. This is referring to the Pharisees. We can make that connection. But if you're illiterate and you don't have the Bible and you're hearing this in a public space and you're retelling a story and you're saying the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, it does kind of start building walls. It's us versus them. So that's one of the reasons why I showed you that video. I thought it would be a nice intro to this discussion as to why we're seeing the term, the Jews, as time progresses in more of a negative context. So this other video comes from the same movie, and this one, Robert, I think you and I were talking several weeks ago, and you made the point about, anti-Semitism, it's out there, but it's mostly an Arab thing these days, that anti-Semitism is mostly found within the Arab community. It's not within the Christian community. You don't find Christians with anti-Semitic attitudes. I think it was something like that, if you remember that discussion. And I said, yes, okay, today that's true. I would agree that you would probably find more people in the Arab world, the Muslim world, who have anti-Semitic attitudes or opinions of Israel versus the Christian community. However, that's today. If you were to go back and look at Christian history, that is not true. I can't remember when exactly Islam ascended or came into being, somewhere around the year 10,000 or so, somewhere 10th, 9th century. For 800 years in the Christian church, there was no Muslim. you will find anti-Semitism. And this little study, well, it's not, it's kind of getting a little bigger and bigger, but this study is going to show you the roots of anti-Semitism begins in the Christian church. And I'm starting in the Gospels and the Acts because critics will point to these books and will point to how the term the Jews are used and how that has over time turned into a monster. Okay, so I'm going to show you another video from the same, let's see if we have enough time. I think we'll probably, yeah, we do. From the same Constantine's sword video, and this one, it was basically tying into Robert's observation that anti-Semitism, mostly within the Arab community, what you'll see in this video is that's not true all the time. And anyway, it's just a kind of reminder that Christianity has baggage, some really evil baggage that it has to deal with if it looks back and then is truthful and looks at how Christians have treated Jews over the centuries. So again, this is from Constantine's sword. It's about 6 minutes, I think, in length. Let's see if it works. Oops, wrong way.
I went to Colorado Springs, now a scene of controversy over one of the biggest religious revivals in our country. It's also the home of the United States Air Force Academy, a destination I'd once envisioned for myself as a young man.
Cadet group reports, all present and accounted for, sir. Give your groups prisoner!
I'm here now because I'd heard that members of the faculty and administration, along with some of the evangelical churches in the area, are on a mission to convert cadets. In my dad's Air Force, that would have been a non-starter. Do you know that as a boy, I harbored an ambition to come here as a cadet?
Really?
I did.
I entered in '73, and I graduated in '77. And my father is a '53 Naval Academy graduate. My eldest son and his wife actually both graduated last year. And my youngest son, he's now a second classman or a junior.
What's happening?
July 29th of 2004, I was invited back to the first annual GLC, Graduate Leadership Conference. My son, Curtis, came over to me and he said, Dad, I know that we're at this party, but I need to talk with you about something. Can we go off base? And he never does that. In my mind, I thought that maybe he'd, God forbid, has there been something with alcohol or drugs or an honor code violation? Has he gotten somebody pregnant? What's going on? He said, look, Dad, I'm probably going to be getting into some serious trouble. And I said, well, what have you done, Curtis? And he said, it's not what I've done, it's what I'm going to do. And I said, okay, enough of this. What is going on? And he said, the next person that calls me a Jew or accuses me or our people of executing Jesus Christ, I'm going to beat the shit out of.
Words an ugly thing, not the ugly thing.
Now, I was surprised because I do have, 3 kids there at the time. I called Casey. I said, what's going on? He said, Dad, this is just the way it is here.
Mikey's 3 kids are his sons, Casey and Curtis, and Casey's wife, Amanda. They met at the academy. She was raised as a Christian.
I'd never heard it in high school. If people knew I was Jewish, it never was a point. It never made any kind of mention. But once I got to the academy, it became I was so aware of it that I was kind of different. I went to lunch that day. I had a flyer for a movie on my plate, and it was for the Passion of the Christ. And it had all kinds of quotes.
Every single place in Mitchell Hall had
every place setting.
That's 4,000 place settings that each single one had an advertisement for the Passion of the Christ.
So over a 3-day period, every time I would go to sit down there's a flyer staring back at me like, why is this okay to do with this movie? And why is it just nobody's making a fuss about this? So we started talking to Chaplain Morton, but I had this feeling the whole time that this was all fruitless.
So I was like, well, if you want to see whether or not it is anti-Semitic, you need to see it yourself, for yourself.
Right.
And so we both went to go see it.
We did. And I felt terrible watching that movie, just absolutely terrible. I look at how they portray Jews. These are my people. We're being portrayed as the people who killed Christ. How can believers look at that and not get pissed and angry at the Jews? It's scary.
I kept telling myself, this is July of 2004. It's not 1096 in the Crusades. It's not 1492. It's not 1939 or 1940. It's not all the spaces in between. It's the United States Air Force Academy.
This out to you. Is this an example of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism? Does anyone have a thought? Is this anti-Semitism what was going on, or is anti-Judaism?
They are not mutually exclusive. You can have both at the same time.
That is true. I do not deny that. In fact, I will make that point later on, so I really appreciate that. However, if you were to look at that, was there any mention about race? Was there anything that signified that the feelings that he, I think it was Casey Weinstein, felt, was it based upon his race, or was it based upon his way of life? So it'd be, which would it be, anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism?
Anti-Semitism, because it's more about race than about way of life.
So does everyone agree here, does it feel like there were racial vibes coming through as far as the Air Force cadets and their attitude toward Casey Weinstein? I actually kind of felt it was more of the way of life, that he wasn't being singled out because of his skin color or his nose size, or that he was a Jew racially. I kind of got the impression it was his religious beliefs that were being threatened and his way of life. So we can disagree, and this is where we get back to, I guess, Jason. They can sometimes overlap, intertwine, and get mixed together. But they don't have to necessarily come together as a package. And I say that is because we, as Christadelphians, can be described as anti-Judaism, holding that the Jewish way of life is not what God has proclaimed, but we don't hate the Jews because of that. So we're an example where we can be anti-Judaism, but we can be one, but we don't have to be the other, which is anti-Semitism. Does someone have something?
Devil's advocate kind of comment / question. So the Passion of the Christ, right, that he was referring to, it made him uncomfortable, right? So is that anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism? That part I think might be anti-Judaism, because he's not a Christian. Right. Calling him a blank Jew would probably be more on the anti-Semitic, because he wouldn't be, no one would be calling him that if his last name wasn't Weinstein, because he doesn't look different from anyone else. You couldn't look at that guy and say he's definitely Jewish. Yeah. So that part would be anti-Semitism. But I don't see it any differently, and whether it's right or wrong, the way our society does it now, is if we're watching something about slavery, and it's look at how they're portraying white people and how horrible they were, and we all agree that slavery was wrong, but there are many things in history that are going to portray different people in different lights, and we move on from that history, right? So that's kind of a comparison.
Yeah, I thought I would throw the question out just for fun. I guess the point I'm trying to make is we need to distinguish between is the opposition we're experiencing and seeing addressed or thrown toward the Jews, is it based upon race, or is it based upon faith? Jason?
I think oftentimes we become oversensitive to a situation. And for instance, when people talk about the terrible things that the Vikings did as they marauded and raided different parts of Europe, I don't take that personally, right? I don't say, oh boy, you know, I can't believe and I'm so ashamed. That was 1,000 years before and far removed from any decision that I currently make. But I think oftentimes for anti-Semitism, people internalize that as a near accusation as opposed to something that happened a long time ago. And those that practice anti-Semitism, it's a near infraction of, meaning it's as if Christ was crucified yesterday and you're responsible for it. When it couldn't be farther from the case. But because they're sensitive to it, they internalize it.
Okay, well, I appreciate everyone's input. That'll be it.